Peter Palmer's hands were covered in sawdust when she walked into his life like she owned the world, and for all he knew, maybe she did. "Is this where the furniture guy works?" the woman asked, stepping into the cramped workshop with heels that didn't belong anywhere near wood shavings and power tools. Her voice was low and smooth, like she never had to raise it to be heard. "That depends," Peter said, setting down the sander. "Are you looking for custom-built furniture or a miracle?" She smiled, but there was something behind her eyes, tired, maybe, or guarded. "Custom furniture. My name's Callie. I just bought a house up in Briar Hill and I need it furnished." "I want everything handmade." Peter wiped his hands on his jeans. "Briar Hill, that's the gated community on the cliffs." "Is that a problem?" she asked, tilting her head. "No. Just not used to people from that side of town walking into my shop without a driver and a clipboard." She laughed, and it startled him how warm it sounded. "I like to be hands-on. Do you have time to come see the space?" Peter hesitated. He had 2 other orders behind, 2 months of unpaid electric bills, and a 6-year-old waiting for him at school pickup. But he needed the work, and this woman didn't look like someone who'd flinch at a high quote. "I can swing by tomorrow morning," he said. "What kind of timeline are you thinking?" "Soon as possible. I'll pay whatever rush fee you need." And just like that, without knowing her last name or how many zeros she had in her bank account, Peter agreed. The next morning, Peter dropped his son, Jace, off at school and drove his beat-up pickup out to Briar Hill. The security guard at the gate looked at him like he didn't belong, which wasn't wrong. But after checking a list and calling someone, the gates opened, and Peter drove through a neighborhood that looked like a luxury magazine exploded. Callie's house was modern and clean, but not cold. White walls, wide windows, and a view of the ocean that stole your breath. She answered the door barefoot, in jeans and a white t-shirt. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. "Sorry about the mess. I just moved in last week." Peter nodded, trying not to stare at the marble floors or the ceiling that seemed to stretch forever. "Nice place. It's quiet." "That's what I needed." She walked ahead of him, and he noticed the slight curve of her back, the way she touched the wall as she passed. "I want a dining table, something big but warm, a reading nook bench by the window, shelves. A bed frame too, but nothing cold or modern. Wood. Real textures." Peter scratched the back of his neck. "That's a lot of pieces." "I know, but I like your work. I found your business through a post online. Someone shared a picture of a crib you made." His chest tightened. That had been one of his first custom orders. He'd built it when Jace was still a baby, sleeping in a laundry basket beside Peter's bed. "I can do it," he said. "I just might need a few weeks." "I trust you." She smiled again, and this time it felt like something shifted in the air. Over the next few days, Peter started bringing sketches to Callie's place. She'd offer him coffee, sit on the floor with him, barefoot and curious, asking questions about how he joined wood and what stain brought out the best grain. She never once mentioned money, but always offered to pay half up front. He refused. One afternoon, she caught him staring at the ocean view. "You ever want to live by the water?" Peter shoved his hands into his pockets. "I'd settle for making rent on time." She turned to look at him. "You have a family." "I got a kid, Jace. He's 6, smart as hell and loud, always asking questions." She laughed, and Peter swore it was the kind of laugh you didn't fake. "You raise him alone?" "Yeah, his mom left when he was 2. Said she wasn't cut out for diapers and cartoons." Callie didn't say anything right away, just nodded and looked out at the sea. "My dad raised me too, after my mom passed. It's not easy." Peter glanced at her. "You don't seem like someone who came from hard times." She shrugged, but didn't explain, and Peter didn't ask. He liked the mystery of her. A week later, he brought Jace with him because his babysitter canceled last minute. "Is it okay if my son hangs out for a bit while I take measurements?" he asked, holding Jace's hand. Callie knelt down and smiled gently. "Hey Jace, I'm Callie. You want to help me water the plants while your dad works?" Jace looked up at Peter, who nodded and then took her hand. "Okay. But I don't like gross vegetables." "They're succulents," Callie said, laughing as she led him to the patio. Peter watched them through the window as he measured the nook for the bench. Jace was talking a mile a minute, and Callie was listening, really listening. She knelt beside him, letting him water pots, and even gave him a cookie from a jar on the counter. Later, on the drive home, Jace said, "I like her. She doesn't talk to me like I'm dumb." Peter smiled despite himself. "Yeah, she's pretty cool." Peter grew used to the sound of her voice, the way she always asked about Jace, the way she made him feel like he wasn't just some guy building furniture because he'd run out of options. He started making her pieces with more care than he'd ever put into anything else. He didn't know what it meant, how he felt around her. He just knew he liked being around her, and he liked building things that would be hers. One afternoon, he was installing the custom dining table in her house, and she brought out lemonade. "I hope you don't mind," she said, setting down the tray. "I told my assistant to cancel my meetings today." Peter raised an eyebrow. "You have an assistant?" "I do. I don't talk about work much. It's complicated." "Fair enough." She sat on the floor beside the table. "You know what I like about you." He looked down at her, heart thumping for no good reason. "What? You never ask me what I do, or how much I make, or why I live alone in a house this size." Peter leaned against the table. "I figure if you want me to know, you'll tell me." Callie looked up at him, something soft in her expression. "You're a good man, Peter." And he didn't know what came over him, but he reached down, brushed a strand of hair from her face, and said, "You make it easy." She didn't pull away. And for the first time in a long time, Peter wondered if maybe, just maybe, someone like her could fall for someone like him. He just didn't know she already had. Peter didn't knock the next time he came to the house. Callie had started leaving the front door open for him, a quiet invitation he hadn't asked for but never questioned. It was late afternoon, and the light through the tall windows cast long shadows across the newly finished bookcase he'd installed the week before. She was in the kitchen, barefoot again, this time in a navy linen jumpsuit with her hair tied back carelessly. She was slicing strawberries, the knife moving with practiced ease. "You're early," she said without looking up. "You said the pantry shelves were ready for staining." "Figured I'd get a head start before it got too dark to see what I'm doing." She glanced at him then. "You always work this late." "When I'm behind," he said, setting his toolbox down by the door, "which is most days." "You ever think about hiring help?" Peter gave a quiet laugh. "Sure." "With what money?" She went silent for a beat, then said, "What if I invested in your business?" He straightened up. "You want to give me money?" I said, "Invest, not give. I believe in what you do, Peter. Your work has soul, that's rare." "And what would you get out of it?" She met his eyes. "A percentage, and the satisfaction of seeing something good grow." Peter walked to the edge of the kitchen, leaning against the archway. "That sounds generous, but I don't take charity." "It's not charity," she said, her gaze steady. "It's business. You're good at what you do. You just need a little breathing room." He studied her for a long moment. "Let me think about it." Callie nodded, returning to the fruit. "Fair enough." Later that evening, as he was packing up, she walked him to the door. Outside, the wind had picked up, rustling the hedges along the stone path. "You're not like anyone I've met before," she said suddenly, her voice quieter than usual. "I could say the same," he replied. She stepped closer, folding her arms loosely. "You ever wonder what this is?" "This," Peter looked at her, his mouth dry for no good reason. "Us? I don't know what to call it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I think about it a lot." He hesitated. "I'm not the kind of man who fits into this world of yours. I'm not polished. I don't wear suits. I've got a kid and a truck that breaks down twice a month." Callie stepped closer. "And I'm not asking you to change." Peter reached for the door handle but paused. "You should know something." "What?" "I don't do halfway." She nodded slowly. "Neither do I." The next morning, Peter found himself driving to the lumber yard earlier than usual. Something in him had shifted. He chose better wood, took longer sanding the edges, and reworked the pantry shelf design entirely. He wasn't just building for money anymore. He was building for her. But while he worked, questions pressed at the back of his mind. Who was she, really? She didn't act like someone who came from luxury, but she moved through her world like she owned it. She never answered calls in front of him, but sometimes he'd catch a flash of frustration when her phone buzzed. She'd brush it aside, always turning her attention back to him like nothing else mattered. That weekend, he brought Jace along again. This time, Callie had set up a small sketch pad and markers on the patio for him. "Thought he might like to draw while you're working," she said, handing Jace a glass of lemonade. Peter raised an eyebrow. "You did this for him." "I remember being his age. Sometimes I just wanted to feel like someone planned for me to be there." Jace looked up from his drawing. Can I show you my picture when I'm done? I'd love that, Callie replied. Peter's chest tightened, watching the ease between them grow. When they left that day, Jace tugged at Peter's sleeve as they walked to the truck. Is she gonna be my stepmom? Peter nearly dropped his keys. Where'd you hear that word? Leo said it at school. His dad got married again. Peter glanced back at the house. Callie's just a friend, buddy, but she makes cookies, and she listens when I talk about dinosaurs. Peter ruffled his son's hair. That doesn't mean anything. But deep down, he wasn't so sure. The following week, Callie disappeared. She didn't answer her door, and her phone went to voicemail. Peter waited by the gate for half an hour before the security guard told him she'd flown out the night before. No details, no timeline. He drove home with the shelf parts still in the back of his truck, his stomach in knots. He didn't hear from her for 4 days. Then, late Thursday night, his phone rang. I'm sorry, she said before he could speak. It was an emergency. I had to fly to London for a board meeting. Peter sat up straighter in bed. Board meeting. There was a pause. I haven't told you everything, she said quietly. I didn't mean to lie, I just didn't want you to look at me differently. I already do, he said. But not for the reason you think. She didn't reply. Callie, who are you? I'm someone who's falling for a man who doesn't care about bank accounts or last names, she said. But if you need to know, my family owns Hartwell Holdings. Peter blinked. The people who bought the shipping ports. And half the hotels in Europe, she added, almost apologetically. I didn't want to lead with that. Peter stood slowly, pressing a hand to his temple. So you're a billionaire? I'm still me. He rubbed his jaw. You should have told me, I know. I was scared. Of what? That you'd walk away. Peter's voice dropped. I should. But he closed his eyes. But I can't. Silence. I'm coming back tomorrow, she said. And if you're still willing, I want to talk. Peter let out a long breath. You better bring coffee. I'll bring breakfast too. He hung up, staring at the dark ceiling, heart pounding. The woman he was falling for wasn't just wealthy. She was the kind of wealthy that made worlds move, and she'd chosen him, but that didn't mean he knew how to live in her world. Not yet. Peter opened the door before she knocked. Callie stood on the porch, holding a cardboard tray with 2 coffees and a paper bag that smelled like cinnamon and sugar. Her hair was down, loose around her shoulders, and there was something different in her posture, an edge of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. I brought breakfast, she said, lifting the tray slightly. Peter stepped aside. You didn't have to, I know. But I wanted to. He led her into the kitchen, careful not to glance at the corner where Jace's science project was drying on the counter. The house wasn't exactly spotless. It was clean but lived in mismatched chairs, drawings tacked to the fridge, a chipped mug next to the sink. Callie set the tray down and pulled 2 muffins from the bag. I wasn't sure what you liked, so I got 1 blueberry and 1 apple streusel. Peter leaned a hand on the counter. You flew back across the Atlantic and came straight here with muffins. I didn't sleep much on the flight. She held his gaze. I kept thinking about what I'd say to you. Peter didn't sit. You could have told me from the start. I know, but I didn't want to lead with money. When people find out, they stop seeing me. They see numbers and headlines. I'm not like most people. That's why I didn't want to lose you. Peter folded his arms. So what now? You think we just go back to how things were? Callie hesitated, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a small envelope. She handed it to him without a word. Inside was a folded legal document, an investment contract drafted by someone who clearly knew what they were doing. Attached to it was a handwritten note in neat cursive, for your workshop, no pressure, only if you want it. Peter stared at the paper, then looked up. You're serious. I don't want you to feel like I'm buying your trust. This isn't about control. It's about believing in you. I can't take charity. It's not charity, she said again, her voice firmer. It's a partnership. On your terms, you run the business, I support it, quietly. He looked at the contract again, then slid it back into the envelope. I'll think about it. Fair. Peter finally sat across from her, resting his elbows on the table. I wasn't expecting you to come here, not like this. I didn't know if you'd even open the door. I almost didn't. Callie's expression flickered. I wouldn't have blamed you. Peter reached for the coffee, took a sip, then set it down. Tell me something I don't know, she blinked. If we're doing this, whatever this is, I need more than just what you didn't say. I want to know who you are when you're not barefoot in designer houses. Callie leaned back slightly. I studied architecture, thought I'd build things someday instead of inheriting them. My father didn't approve. Peter raised an eyebrow. You designed buildings. 3. Before I walked away from the firm, I was tired of designing things I wasn't allowed to believe in. Why'd you walk away? She hesitated. Because money doesn't fix everything. It just distracts you from the things that actually hurt. Peter nodded slowly, letting that sit between them. You want something real, he said. I want something that doesn't come with strings or NDAs or people pretending to care because they want a piece of something. Peter tilted his head. And you think that's me? I know it's you. He stood and walked to the sink, staring out the window. The wind moved the branches of the oak tree in the backyard. He remembered building the tree swing for Jace 2 summers ago, using leftover rope and sanded planks. It wasn't fancy, but it had never broken. You ever think about what this looks like from my side? He said without turning around. I try to. I'm a single dad, with a business that barely covers groceries. You show up in my life with ocean views and private planes. That's a lot to process. I'm not asking you to process it all at once. I just want honesty. Peter turned around. Then here it is. I don't know what to do with this. I like you, more than I should. But I've spent my whole life building things so they don't fall apart. I don't know how to build something with someone like you. Callie stood, walked to him, and placed her hand gently on his chest. Then let's build it together, one piece at a time. He looked down at her hand, then into her eyes. You really mean that? I don't say things I don't mean. Jace's voice echoed from the hallway. Dad, I can't find my sneakers. Peter didn't move, didn't look away from Callie. In the laundry basket, under your jacket. A pause. Found them. Callie smiled. You're good at that. At what? Knowing what needs fixing without even looking. He let out a slow breath. Maybe, but not everything can be fixed. Maybe not. But some things can be made new. Peter lowered his forehead to hers briefly, just for a second before pulling away. I've got to take him to his friend's birthday, he said. Can we talk more tonight? I'll be here. When he returned hours later, the shelf he'd been meaning to finish stood completed in the corner. Sanded, stained, and sealed, a note was tucked into one of the cubbies. Tried to keep my hands busy. Hope I didn't mess up your design, Callie. He ran his fingers along the edge and smiled despite himself. She wasn't waiting for him to catch up. She was already building her place in his world quietly, piece by piece. Peter stood in the middle of his workshop, surrounded by the sharp scent of cedar and a half-assembled headboard, but his focus was elsewhere. The contract Callie had left sat unopened on the workbench. He hadn't touched it in days, not because he wasn't interested, but because it terrified him. He was used to scraping by, to building out of what he had, not what he needed. But she'd offered him something solid, something permanent, and that was harder to accept than the hunger in his belly or the overdraft notices. When the door creaked open, he looked up, expecting one of his suppliers or maybe his neighbor dropping off scrap wood. Instead, it was Callie. I figured you'd be here, she said, stepping inside without hesitation. She wore a faded sweatshirt and jeans, her hair pulled into a braid. You didn't answer my call. I was working. I guessed that too. She glanced at the untouched envelope. Still thinking, Peter wiped his hands on a rag. I've been going back and forth. It's not just about pride, it's about control. Once you take money from someone, it changes the dynamic. Suddenly they're not a person anymore, they're leverage. Callie stepped closer, her voice steady. Then let me give you something else. No contracts, no equity, just a loan. Pay me back in your own time. No interest, no strings. Peter narrowed his eyes. Why would you do that? Because I believe in what you're doing. And because I've watched you stretch yourself thin for months, pouring yourself into everyone else's world but your own. He leaned against the workbench, arms crossed. I don't want to owe anyone. You wouldn't, Callie said. You'd just have a partner who wants to see you breathe for once. He looked at her, at the sincerity in her eyes, and something quiet inside him started to shift. You really don't want anything back. I already got what I wanted. What's that? You. That word hit him harder than any offer on paper. Peter turned away, busying his hands with a chisel that didn't need adjusting. I don't know how to be the kind of man who walks into your world and doesn't feel like he's constantly tripping over the carpet. Callie stepped beside him, not touching, just close enough for him to feel her warmth. Then don't walk into my world. Let's build our own. He looked at her for a long moment, then reached for the envelope and tore it in half, her brows lifted. Was that the contract? It was, but you're right. I don't need a contract to know what you mean to me. That night, after Jace was asleep, Peter stood on the porch of Callie's house, holding a folded sketch in his hand. She opened the door before he knocked, as if she'd been waiting. I want to show you something, he said, stepping inside. She followed him to the kitchen, where he spread the sketch across the island. It was a design for a new storefront, his own. Not just a workshop, but a gallery space, complete with a children's corner where Jace's drawings could hang. You drew this? She asked quietly. He nodded. I've had it in my head for years, just never thought it could be real. Callie traced a finger along the lines. This is beautiful. I don't want a handout, he said, but if you still want to help, maybe we do this together. I'll build it. You guide me through the business side. I'd love that. He watched her eyes move over the paper and the way her shoulders settled, as if some invisible weight had lifted. You okay? He asked. Yeah, just... This feels like the first time someone's let me be part of building something that wasn't already mine. Peter reached for her hand. Well, now it is. A month later, the new space opened on the edge of downtown, a modest storefront with warm lighting, hand-carved signage, and displays that made people stop on the sidewalk and press their noses to the glass. Jace cut the ribbon with plastic scissors while Peter stood behind him, one hand on his son's shoulder. Callie stood beside them, dressed simply, her eyes shining as the small crowd clapped. Inside, shelves held Peter's pieces, tables, benches, even a rocking chair Callie had encouraged him to build from an old design he'd sketched years ago. A quiet buzz of conversation filled the air as guests admired the craftsmanship and asked questions. Hey, she said softly, pulling him aside once the crowd thinned. You see that guy in the corner? He's a buyer from a design hotel group. He asked about placing an order. Peter blinked. Seriously. He shook his head, laughing under his breath. This doesn't feel real. It is. He looked at her, at the way her eyes had crinkles at the corners when she smiled, at how she never once needed to be the center of attention, even though she could have been. I've been thinking, he said. Dangerous. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside was a ring, not flashy, just a simple band with a thin inlay of polished walnut. Her breath caught. I made it from the first table I ever built, he said. Not because I couldn't afford something else, but because I wanted it to mean something. Callie looked at him, eyes glassy, lips parted but silent. I don't know how to be perfect, he said, but I know how to build things that last. And I want to build something with you for good. She didn't answer with words. She stepped forward, looped her arms around his neck, and kissed him so completely it silenced every doubt he'd been carrying. The crowd noticed, applauded. Jace ran over, tugged at Peter's sleeve. Are you getting married? Callie crouched down, beaming. Only if it's okay with you. Jace nodded solemnly. Only if I get to be the ring guy. You got it, Peter said, lifting him into a hug. The night ended with laughter, music, and a private toast between just the three of them, Peter, Callie, and Jace, on the rooftop of the building where the stars stretched endlessly above them. They didn't need chandeliers or ballrooms. They had sawdust, sunlight, and a love built one careful piece at a time, and this time nothing was going to fall apart. The early morning sun had only just begun to peek over the rooftops as Peter ran a hand through his hair and glanced down at the calendar hanging crookedly on the wall of his new office, a converted storage room above the showroom. The space still smelled faintly of fresh paint and cedar oil. There, circled in red, was a date he'd never expected to matter so much today. He was getting married. The thought made his chest tighten, not with nerves, but with a raw, impossible joy that still crept up on him in quiet moments. He never imagined a woman like Callie Hartwell would be waiting at the end of an aisle for him, a man who'd spent half his life chasing overdue invoices and sleepless nights. Peter glanced around the space. The showroom downstairs had been closed for the day, a handwritten sign taped to the glass. Closed for love. He exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. A knock on the doorframe drew his attention. Dylan, his new apprentice, leaned in, holding a small box. Found what you asked for. It was buried under the sanding table. Peter opened the box and pulled out the wooden cufflinks he'd carved weeks ago. The walnut matched Callie's ring inlay. He nodded once in thanks. You headed out soon? Dylan asked, already backing away. Yeah. Just needed a minute. The younger man gave a thumbs up and disappeared down the stairs. Peter stood in front of the mirror. His suit still felt foreign, too crisp, too expensive, but it fit. Callie had insisted on having it tailored. He adjusted the cuffs, fastened the links, and with one final glance, grabbed the small velvet box from the drawer and slipped it into his pocket. The ceremony was being held in the garden behind the showroom, transformed overnight into something that looked like it belonged in a film, a winding path of lanterns, hanging jasmine, and chairs draped in ivory ribbon. The air smelled like spring and salt, and the sky was a shade of blue that made you believe in second chances. Peter stepped out just as the music started, the gentle strumming of strings echoing softly across the garden. He found Jace waiting near the front, his suit slightly too big and his tie already crooked. You ready, partner? Peter asked, kneeling beside him. Jace nodded solemnly. I practiced my step like you said, no tripping. Peter grinned. That's all I ask. As the guests stood, the music shifted. Peter turned to face the aisle. Callie appeared, walking slowly, her dress a flowing cascade of silk and lace that shimmered as she moved. Her hair was swept back, revealing earrings shaped like small leaves he'd carved the originals out of wood for her to show to a jeweler. She held no bouquet. She didn't need one. She glowed with a kind of quiet confidence that made Peter feel like gravity had shifted around her. When she reached him, she didn't say anything at first. She just reached out, took his hand, and whispered, You look like home. The officiant began to speak, but Peter barely heard a word. All he could see was the woman in front of him, the one who had stepped across every line and expectation to meet him where he stood. When it came time for vows, Peter took a breath and pulled the velvet box from his pocket. I made something, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I know, surprise. The guests chuckled softly. He opened the box and held it out. Inside was a small wooden pendant, carved into the shape of a house with a window in the center. This is where I keep my heart, he said. With you, no matter where we go, what we build next, this will always be it. You are my home. Callie's eyes glistened as she reached up and fastened the delicate chain around her neck. When it was her turn, she pulled a folded piece of paper from her dress and unfolded it carefully. I've spent most of my life in rooms filled with people who talked louder than they listened, she said. And then I met you. You didn't just hear me, you saw me. Not the last name or the bank account or the press releases. Just me. You made space for me in your world, and I will spend the rest of my life making space for you in mine. They exchanged rings, hers still the simple walnut inlay, his a brushed silver band etched with a small tree on the inside, a nod to the oak in his backyard, where Jace's swing still hung. When the words were spoken and the kiss sealed everything that had grown between them, the crowd erupted into applause, but Peter only heard one voice, Callie's, soft in his ear as she whispered, We did it. They danced under strings of golden lights to a song neither of them remembered choosing, Jace tugging at their hands halfway through to cut in. Peter lifted his son onto his shoulders as the song changed, and Callie laughed so hard she nearly doubled over. Later, in the quiet of the night, Peter and Callie stood in the workshop, now empty and still. She leaned against the workbench, barefoot, her dress gathered around her ankles. Do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't walked into your shop that day? She asked. Peter walked over, placed his hands on her waist. I try not to, because I don't want to imagine a world where you didn't. She tilted her head. What now? We live, he said. We raise Jace. We build more things, maybe not just furniture, she smiled at him. You thinking what I'm thinking, he nodded. We open that second location, the one you found by the coast. And maybe we add a classroom, she said. Teach kids how to make things. Give them tools that aren't just digital. Peter kissed her forehead. That's why I married you. No, she teased. You married me because I make a mean cinnamon muffin. That too, the lights overhead dimmed on their own, programmed to shut off at midnight. Peter reached for her hand. Let's go home. 3 years later, the second location stood proudly on the cliffs near the coast, overlooking the water that once separated their worlds. Inside, families gathered around long tables, learning to carve and sand to build and create. Peter taught the Saturday classes himself, while Jace ran between rooms, now 10 and full of opinions. Callie ran the operations, but she never stayed in the office longer than needed. She preferred to be among the people, hands covered in sawdust, heart wide open. They lived in a house not far from the shop, one they'd designed together. The tree's swing still hung in the yard, only now it had a matching one beside it. Every night, after Jace was in bed, Peter would find Callie in the nook by the window he'd built for her years ago, her fingers brushing the pendant she always wore. And every night, without fail, she would look up and say, "Still feels like day one." And Peter would answer, "That's how I know it's real," and it was, always.